Hi, Bluminaka everyone. My name is Zoe and I'm currently a 4th year dermal science student at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia. Now, I have a profound passion for skin health, so helping others achieve their ideal skin goals and helping others gain a better understanding around their skin concerns such as eczema, acne, scarring. This has been a passion of mine for some time. Now, in saying that, I am here to share with you, my Fijian and Pacifica Islander fam, some of my knowledge that I've gained over the years around a common skin condition that is quite prevalent within our community. Now, you may have referred to this condition as dark marks or dark spots or scarring even, and you may have it even experienced at some point where you have experienced some form of trauma to the skin that resulted in a dark mark that lingered in the area for a lot longer than you would have liked. Now, this dark mark, what it's actually called is hyperpigmentation. Hyperpigmentation. Now, that is a proper term for these dark marks. They may also be referred to as post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. Now, the main aim of this video is to basically share with you some of my knowledge around hyperpigmentation, and hopefully it will give you a better understanding as to what it actually is, why it occurs, and what you can do to treat it. So in saying that, I hope you enjoyed this educational video as much as I enjoyed creating it for you.
Hyperpigmentation is a concentration of pigment or melanin within an area, resulting in those spots or marks that are darker than the surrounding skin. Now, there are many causes of hyperpigmentation. However, there are three main causes or factors that cause this condition. One is inflammation, known as post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation or PIH. Second factor is ultraviolet radiation, so sun exposure such as sunspots or freckles. And third factor is hormonal changes such as melasma. Now, in saying that, hyperpigmentation is more common in those of us with darker skin tones due to our genetics. Given that darker skin tones already produce more pigment, means we are more inclined to get these dark spots because of the frequently active cells that produce pigment. Now, as I mentioned it, there are many factors that lead to this skin condition. However, we are going to be focusing on inflammation. This is one of the main factors of hyperpigmentation, and this main factor is known as post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. Post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. Now, I know that's a long word, so I'll be referring to it as PIH. Now, this is a term used to describe hyperpigmentation that has been caused by inflammation. Post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. What is that? Well, first, let's break down the term. Post refers to after events, so for example, postgraduate, post-war, and inflammatory is a word derived from inflammation. It's a condition of swelling and redness, and this is basically your body's natural reaction to protect itself. Hyperpigmentation, if we break that down into two, hyper refers to in excess, and pigment refers to the coloring of one's skin. Let's take a closer look at PIH. So it's a concentration of pigment or melanin, and inflammation causes an increase of this melanin to be produced within the skin. Now, some of the common skin conditions that cause this are eczema, burns, boils, acne, cuts, and rashes, to name a few. And traumas such as surgical wounds or superficial traumas such as aggressive scrubs can also lead to PIH, and it is very common in dark skin tones. Where does PIH occur? Where can you get it? Well, as we can see in these images, we've got face, arm, legs, so pretty much anywhere on the surface of the skin where you've experienced trauma, injury, or some form of inflammation. In order to understand why PIH occurs or why it happens, I'm going to talk you through the skin's anatomy, and we're going to be looking at three main points, which are pigment or melanin synthesis, which is basically the production of melanin in the skin. We're going to look at wound healing phases, and then we're going to look at how inflammation affects melanin synthesis. The skin is known as the integumentary system, and it is the body's largest organ. Now, the role is to pretty much protect your insides from the outside environment. Now, having a look at the structure of the skin, on the left here we have a cross-section diagram where you can see the hair follicles, sweat glands, capillary networks, and the various layers of the skin. Starting off on the top, we have the epidermis layer. Now, this is the topmost layer of the skin, and it is the first line of defense against pathogens, bacteria, etc. Second is the dermis. This is known as the structural layer where collagen and elastin fibers are produced, and they act as a scaffolding sort of mechanism to keep the skin nice and firm and plump. On the bottom is the hypodermis. Now, this is known as the insulation layer where it works to keep the body temperature warm and balanced, and where energy is stored. The epidermis, being the topmost layer of the skin, has a further 5 layers to it, as it is the first line of defense against the outside environment. Now, this little layer works hard to protect the rest of the body from harmful, nasty substances that would cause an imbalance or an injury to the rest of the body. The layers starting from the top are known as stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basal. Now, the main cell within the epidermis is known as a keratinocyte. Keratin means protein and cyte means cell. These keratinocytes are born in the basal layer down the bottom, and the lifespan of a keratinocyte is around 28 days. So as it makes its way up to the top, it loses the nucleus, which is the purple round circles you can see in the middle. And as it loses the nucleus, it flattens out and slowly sheds up away from the surface of the skin. Now, the other cell I would like to point out in this diagram is the melanocyte. This cell has an octopus type of appearance, and it lives within the basal layer down the bottom. This is the cell that makes or produces melanin, or also known as pigment. Okay, in order to really understand why PIH is more common in those of us with darker skin colors, we need to understand how pigment is produced. So, here is a closer look at a melanocyte. As you can see, it has finger-like appearances projecting away from the body of the cell. These are called dendrites. Now, over on the right side, we can see a close-up of the melanocyte sitting within that basal layer of the epidermis just down the bottom. Now, the orange little dots within the melanocyte traveling up through the dendrites are called melanosomes. Now, these melanosomes are like little packages, and these packages are carrying melanin, or as we know it, pigment. And these dendrites are depositing these melanosomes straight into the keratinocytes. Now, if you take a closer look at the keratinocytes, they actually have the melanosomes sitting on top of those purple circles, which is called the nucleus. The reason for the melanosomes arranging themselves in this umbrella sort of position on top of the nucleus is because they are protecting the DNA within the nucleus from the UV rays or sun rays. This is to basically prevent sun damage to the DNA. Now we're going to take a look at the melanin making pathway within the melanocyte. This term is known as melanogenesis. Let's break this down. Melanin is the pigment made up of protein to protect DNA, and genesis means the beginning of something. So in this case, the beginning of the melanin making process. Okay, so here is a step-by-step illustration on how melanin is synthesized, or in simpler terms, how it is made within this cell. On the bottom right, we have the endosome, which is an organelle. Then we have tyrosinase, which is an enzyme. They join together with the melanosome, which was those packets that I spoke about earlier, at stage 1. Then from there, the melanin is made within the melanosome packet. So basically the endosome acts as a traffic controller and directs the tyrosinase enzyme over to the melanosome, where the three of them start to make melanin. Here is another illustration of melanogenesis. On the bottom right is the first phase, where there are exchanges between genes, proteins, and enzymes. This then causes that conversion to melanin within those melanosome packets. Now, this is where genetics plays a huge part in how much melanin is made within the cell. Once the melanosomes are done, they travel up through the dendrites, as you can see at the third point. They are then transferred to the keratinocytes at the fourth point, followed by the release of the melanin out of the melanosome packets, and are arranged on top of the nucleus in that umbrella-like fashion, as you can see at the fifth point. Okay, so now that we understand how melanin is made, why does the skin make it? Well, the purpose of melanin being produced in the skin is to protect the DNA from ultraviolet or UV damage. Basically, it's protecting the skin from the harsh rays of the sun. So what melanin does is it absorbs the UV rays and converts it to heat. That's why someone that has a light skin color tends to burn faster than someone who is of a darker skin color. Skin color is known as skin phototype or skin tone. As you can see on the left side of the diagram, there is more melanin sitting on the keratinocytes as opposed to the right side. This is why there is a variation of skin phototypes. A little fun fact, everyone has the same amount of melanocytes sitting in the basal layer no matter what their skin phototype is. Your phototype is mainly dependent on your genetics, and this is what causes the amount of melanin made within the melanocyte. Okay, so recap as to what we've learned so far. We now have an understanding of melanin synthesis, where melanin is produced by cells within the skin known as melanocytes. Tyrosinase is the enzyme that causes the production of melanin, and the purpose of melanin is to protect our DNA from UV damage. Okay, so now that we have established that, we are going to take a closer look at wound healing phases and how this relates to PIH. The wound healing process is made up of 4 phases that overlap one another. These phases are known as hemostasis, inflammation, proliferation, and remodeling. Our main focus is the second phase, inflammation. This is the skin's defense phase against the outside environment. As you can see in this illustration, this is visually what the wound healing phases look like. At number 1, there is the beginning of a blood clot formation. Then at number 2, there is swelling and pain. This is the inflammation phase. Number 3, you can see the wound area has closed, and at number 4, complete wound healing has occurred where a scab has formed on the surface. Now, the inflammation phase, as I mentioned earlier, is the body's natural defense mode. In this instance, the skin is what we're specifically referring to. Inflammation can happen due to pathogens or germs, bacteria or allergens such as dust or perfume that causes irritation. Internal consumption of certain foods can cause inflammation. Certain conditions, as mentioned earlier, such as acne, eczema, burns, cuts, bruises, etc., these all cause some form of physical trauma to the skin, which then induces or switches on inflammation. And within this phase, a series of wound healing defense responses take place. So, when this inflammation phase is switched on, blood capillaries are dilated. which pretty much means they are expanded or grow bigger to allow oxygen, nutrients, hormones, proteins, and immunity cells to travel at a fast pace to the site of injury. This is why you see redness and swelling in the area sometimes. Now, when this happens, there is a release of various chemical signals that work to fight pathogens or harmful substances. Now, the release of these chemical signals protect the skin's integrity and switch on melanogenesis. Okay, so quick recap of what we've gone through so far. We've gone through melanin synthesis, so pretty much how melanin is produced. We've gone through the wound healing phase, so there are 4 stages, and the inflammation stage is the body or the skin's defense phase. And this inflammation phase releases chemical signals, and these chemical signals work to protect the skin's integrity and switch on melanogenesis. Now we're going to have a look at inflammation and its effects on melanin synthesis. Okay, so here we have the melanocyte in the middle. Remember, this is our melanin producing cell, and above that is the keratinocyte, where our DNA lives within the nucleus of this cell. Now, below these 2 cells is another cell called a fibroblast. The fibroblast's role is to produce or make collagen and elastin. Now, these 2 cells, the keratinocyte on top and the fibroblast down the bottom, release chemical signals known as cytokines. The release of cytokines to the melanocyte cause an over-increase of melanin to be produced to protect our DNA. Now, these cytokines are basically little proteins that message other cells to assist each other to defend, regulate, and rebalance the skin. So these chemical signals is like a telephone line between cells. This is how they communicate with one another to keep everything in check and balanced. Here we have a really great illustration on the right where there is a major increase of melanin being produced and deposited into the keratinocytes. That cell-to-cell communication via chemical signals that we just spoke about are taking place down the bottom of this image. We can see those melanosome packets being released via the dendrites or the tentacle arms of the melanocyte, and then the melanin coloring can be seen accumulating up on the surface, which is resulting in that darkening up the top. Here again we can see that darkening appearing on the surface on the left due to that increased melanin that's being produced down in the basal layer. On the right is a few images of PIH due to eczema of the leg and acne on the face. Now remember, this excess pigment that is being produced is to protect the DNA within the nucleus of our skin cells from UV damage. So now that you know how and why melanin is being produced and how and why inflammation comes about, these 2 factors is what causes those dark spots, aka PIH, appearing on the surface. It is all because the skin is aiming to protect our DNA within the skin cells from further damage. Okay, so recap time on what we have discussed around why PIH occurs. Now, starting from the top, we have covered melanin synthesis. So, melanin is produced by a cell known as melanocytes, and an enzyme known as tyrosinase induces melanogenesis. And the reason for melanin within the skin is to protect DNA from UV damage. Then we looked at wound healing phases and how inflammation is the skin's defense phase, and the release of chemical signals switches on the melanogenesis cycle. Then lastly, we covered how and why inflammation increases melanogenesis, as this is again mainly to protect DNA within the skin cells, and this is why we get that darkening spot-like appearance on the surface of the skin. Alright, so now that we know why PIH occurs, how can we treat it? Well, given that there are various contributing factors to PIH, there is various methods to treat and manage it, such as lifestyle factors, topical agents, or simply skincare products, as well as clinic treatments. Now, this is part one of a two-part series of what are these dark marks on my skin. In part two, I will be discussing in detail various skin ingredients and clinic treatments to help you treat and manage PIH today. Well, I hope this video has been somewhat educational for you. Until then, take care and remember, you are beautiful.